make a little note of any questions you have. I'm really excited to hear all of them later. Great, thank you, Michael, so much. Yeah. Great. So our next speaker is Yul. And so Yul has been a sustainability solutions group principal for over 15 years. He pioneered land use and greenhouse gas emission planning in Canada, helped introduce the LEED for Homes rating system in Canada, and co-developed the integrated design process course used throughout Canada and the US. Yul has worked on and led more than 40 community energy and greenhouse gas plans and models across Canada. That's a lot of plans. He has leading expertise on climate change mitigation and adaptation systems modeling that incorporates energy, greenhouse gas emissions, and co-benefits. Yul serves as a director on the boards of the Canada Research Chair on Sustainable Community Development, the Canadian Worker Cooperative Federation, and Tatamagouche Community Land Trust. So he'll be speaking to us today about community land trust model and his experiences with that. So, yes, thank you.
Thank you. So how many people here are familiar with community land trusts? Cool, lots of people. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the community land trust that I'm part of, which I've subtitled A Radical and Subtle Alternative for Housing. Subtle because it kind of is radical without people noticing, which may undermine the whole model. So what is a community land trust? It's a nonprofit corporation that develops and stewards affordable housing and many other uses, any kind of use you can think of on the land, really, on behalf of a community. It tries to balance the needs of individuals and the needs of communities. So the need of individual for security and the need of communities to maintain affordability, economic diversity, and local access to essential services. And so really it tries, the radical element of the community land trust, I think, is that it tries to undermine the private property system. And private property is a key component of any good capitalist endeavor. So if we go to the roots of community land trusts, in North America, I mean, there's many philosophical roots that I think have been traced back to indigenous communities, the Greeks, all sorts of historical precedents. But the one that in North America that really started this discussion was called New Communities, Inc. And has anyone here heard of that? No. So this was started by a cousin of Martin Luther King, a guy called Slater King, along with some other activists during that period. And it was attempting to be a solution to the sharecropper issue in the South. And so they wanted to find a way that they could basically take control of land and farm that land and to have security, which they didn't have at all. So they formed what was called New Communities, Inc. In collaboration with a bunch of other people. And it was a very successful model. They brought in a new variety of grapes that hadn't been grown in that area, experimented with it, and were doing very well economically in 5,000 acres. And then a major drought hit, and all the neighboring farms were able to access funding from the federal government. However, they were denied. But in some sort of bizarre situation, they also had to give collateral to the federal government even though they didn't get a loan. And that collateral ended up in the extraction of this farm from that group of people in what was a very illegal move. And subsequently, they were awarded, I think, $13 million in compensation as a result of this story. And there's some really interesting documentaries and so forth on this story. But the most important part of it is the legacy that it has left us. Thank you. So I don't think you guys can really see any of this, unfortunately, but this is trying to map all of the influences that gave rise to the idea of community land trusts. And there's all sorts of interesting people that I hadn't really heard about, and maybe some of you have, but that was a really dynamic time in the US in terms of the peace movement, in terms of the, all sorts of different social movements, really. And a lot of the people who were involved in those movements helped contribute to the birth of community land trusts. So we have like this guy called Charles Sherrod, probably some people here know, who's an organizer with SNCC, Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee. We have Ralph Borisodi, who is an economist. We have Henry George. Has anyone heard of him? He was an interesting economist who was really popular in the late, the late 1900s in the U.S. And his idea was to try and solve inequality not through labor struggle, but through reconfiguring the way land ownership happens. And he was very popular. His ideas were very popular in that late 19th century in the U.S. So a fascinating character. And his ideas inspired a number of others. In addition to what was happening in the US, there was a bunch of work that was really inspired by Gandhi that helped influence the community land trust movement in the US. So in particular, Vinoba Behave, who I'm not sure if I'm saying his name right, but he started the land gift movement, where he went around getting land from rich landowners and giving it to the people who had no land. And that was a very successful movement in India at the time. And then also the Gramdan movement, which I believe was actually, or maybe I'm getting that one mixed up, but there was another one where a community would actually, or people within a community would donate their entire community to a cooperative arrangement. So basically eliminating private ownership within India. And these movements really inspired some of the people who started the community land trusts, including Slater King and Charles Sherrod, who was really instrumental in that first community land trust, and Ralph Borisodi. And then they formed E.F. Schumacher Society, which was in the Berkshires again, right, which probably has similar roots to the Letts scheme, and created some of the first community land trusts in the Berkshires. And so now community land trusts are resonating more and more because of the price of land. Because particularly in cities like New York and Vancouver and others where land is just basically out of reach of most people. So the radical root again piece I think is that this is from a campaign in New York where land is for profit on one side, which is really the speculative capitalist approach to the use of land, versus the community land trust, which says that land is for people. So how does the land trust work? Unfortunately, this is not visible, but the key feature about community land trust is that the land ownership is taken out of the private property system. So land is removed from the private property system and put into the ownership of a nonprofit entity in perpetuity. And by doing that, you make land valueless in the private property market, because if you can't own the land, it has no monetary value. That basically guarantees its perpetual affordability. Then, to give individual security, you give a long-term lease to individuals. And so for residential leases, it's typically 99 years. For other types of leases, like agricultural leases, it can be a shorter period. And that lease allows people to invest in the property without actually owning the land. And so if I build a house, I can sell the house that I build for the value of what I put into it, but I can't sell it for what the market thinks it's worth. And that's built into your lease agreement. And so that basically guarantees affordability in perpetuity. And then a good community land trust will also set up, in cooperation typically with credit unions or other progressive financial institutions, mechanisms to provide loans or mortgages to people who are either buying a house that's already been built or need to build a house on a community land trust. And so that allows people who would not otherwise be able to afford houses to get houses. And you can use the same approach for farming activity, for forestry activity, for basically any other type of use on the land that you need. And so it's a very powerful structure that way. And these are the kind of key principles of a community land trust. Nonprofit organization owns the land in perpetuity. It's dual ownership. And so the dual part ownership is actually the wrong word here, but it's the land trust owns the land and the individual owns the whatever contribution they make to that land. So the construction of a house or the improvement of fields or whatever that might be. The person who lives on the land doesn't own it, but they lease it. Perpetual affordability, perpetual responsibility. So the land trust has responsibility, is the steward of that land in perpetuity. And so if the person who's leasing the land does ecological or social harm, ecological harm to the land or social harm to the community, then it's the responsibility of the land trust to remove that person. It's based in the community, and there's a governance structure that integrates the community into that process. And then the fascinating piece, which is also probably challenging, is that all community land trusts are by definition expansionist. So I think that one was kind of stolen from capitalism, but the idea is that the lease fees that people who live on the land more than cover the cost of the community land trust, and that excess is used to buy more land to start more community land trusts, and so it should expand. And so over the next billion years, we'll probably remove private property ownership. Or that's our it's a lot, at this rate, it's a very long. So it's not actually fully true that it isn't expanding because, I mean, that it is expanding so slowly because this is a map of the UK. UK didn't really get on board with community land trusts until maybe 10 or 12 years ago, and it's just gone crazy there. So it was actually, I think, part of one of the federal government policies at one point, I think when Labour was in power or something like that. And then it has just become a grassroots movement that has really expanded dramatically within that context. And similar in the US, I just pulled this map today, but I was looking at one, I think 5 years ago, and it had 220 community land trusts in the US. Now we're up to 330. So, I mean, this is very much a reaction to the inability of most people to get access to housing. So that's what's really driving this reaction. And we see all sorts of, like, it's really happening at the municipal scale. New York City gave, I think, $2.6 million to grassroots groups to start community land trusts. And I'm like, I mean, 2.6 is great, but in the context of how much money there is in New York City, it's marginal.
Can you tell us the difference between the red and white?
Those are the community land trusts that are a member of this organization, which is a national community land trust organization in the US, versus those that aren't. So in Canada, there are not a lot of community land trusts. This is actually the oldest one that I know about, at least. This is Ward's Island in Toronto. Has anyone been there?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a fascinating place. It's like the hotbed of all good things that happen in Toronto in a sense. But and one of the reasons is that it doesn't cost very much to live there. And the only problem is there's like a 10-year longer waiting list to actually get a house there because it's in such high demand. But it's the only community land trust in Canada with its own provincial act. So it's actually run by an act of the legislature in Ontario. Amazing place, no cars. It's a car-free neighborhood in Toronto, for anyone who hasn't been there. This is one of the newest community land trusts. This is a really fascinating story because a guy from the States in Champlain Housing Community Land Trust, which is the biggest community land trust in the US in Burlington, Vermont, moved up to work with a credit union, a very progressive credit union in Vancouver called Van City. And Van City is good friends with the mayor in Vancouver, and together they came up with this idea, amongst many other people, of creating community land trusts as a mechanism to deal with housing inaffordability in Vancouver. And so the city donated the land to the community land trust, which is a typical mechanism for community land trusts to get land, and partnered with the Co-op Housing Association, who then built housing co-ops on the community land trust. So you're getting all sorts of interesting mixes of systems there. And this building, I think, is just finished now. I can't remember how many units are in it, but they're working on expanding that model fairly significantly within Vancouver. So that's a really significant development in Canada. This is the one on Lopez Island, which is in the San Juan Islands, just west of Seattle, or northwest of Seattle, which I was actually just there a month ago, I think. And it's a really interesting model because they put sustainability at the heart of what their community land is. So the one that I live on is called Tatamagouche Community Land Trust. It's about 100 acres. The way we got the land for that is a bunch of friends and I pooled funds to buy it. It was $95,000 14 years ago or something like this. So we put in about $10,000 each, bought the land, gave the land to the Community Land Trust, and we've given residential leases back. Now there's 4 houses on the land, and we're about to issue a few more leases shortly. There's also 2 agricultural leases, so there's one market garden / CSA, and there's another budding cattle operation. So this community land trust is not fully functional, mainly because of our inadequacies, but it has great intentions. So one of the parts that isn't fully functional right now is the governance structure. A community land trust should have a board that's 1/3 community members, 1/3 leaseholders, and 1/3 wise people appointed by those other two parties. And the intention there is you're balancing the interests of the community, the leaseholders, and then when they fight, you have the wise people to help them sort that out. And so we haven't fully implemented that structure, although we have made fits and starts to do that. So that's one piece that is critical that we haven't fully implemented. I think the community land trust, the Tatamagouche Community Land Trust has been a really fun experiment on so many levels. So there's always interesting activities and efforts that are bubbling away there.
Sorry, is Waldegrave Farm just a part of the Tatamagouche, or do you guys also just, is it interchangeable, Waldegrave Farm and Tatamagouche Community?
You can slice and dice it in a lot of different ways, so that may require a 10-minute conversation later on.
Okay.
So here's our actual purpose: to hold the land in trusteeship, to restore the spiritual and physical relationship between land and people in the land, to preserve and protect the land, to advance ecological forestry and organic farming, provide for a just distribution of natural resources, to provide access to the land for those who wouldn't normally have it, to provide education about CLTs, and to make land available to people who use it in ways consistent with the above. So that's a whole bunch of stuff, and we haven't done all of that, but we're working on it. Another piece where I think we haven't really fulfilled what our intentions was to provide access to land for those who wouldn't normally have access to it. So that affordability piece, we still haven't lived up to that. One of the other fascinating discussions we have had around TCLT is we have a gross injustice around First Nations in Canada around stealing the land, essentially. So a community land trust would be a really interesting way to give land back to the First Nations community while still providing security to people who live on it. And that's one of the kind of interesting discussions that has occurred often late at night. So one piece that we have done, I think, really successfully is we developed bylaws and lease agreements. And these are like the mechanics that make community land trust actually function. And they're really valuable documents because they're quite hard to create. And we were lucky in having some lawyers contribute pro bono to have those done. I'm almost done. But that's one thing that we have that we can give to anyone who needs such things. And that's it. How's that?